the incumbents are scared, but rather than try to embrace the technology, they instead complain, and they want to see some way to regulate it or use litigation in order to slow down the progress and try to protect the castle that they've built. To ancient Rome, right? There was competition throughout society. There was competition on a local basis in terms of various merchants. There was competition among the farmers. There was competition even at the highest levels in terms of who was going to be emperor. And sometimes that competition played out in a very democratic type process. And sometimes that competition literally was decided by the sword. And so then if you look at something like Bitcoin, it's the exact same thing. You literally not only have a protection of your purchasing power, but you also have a decentralized network that has taken billions of dollars to create, where all of these miners, these node operators, and these developers are working in concert with each other to protect your economic value. That literally was reserved historically only for kings or nation states. You know, if you do the things that you really enjoy doing, you'll surprise yourself in terms of what you can accomplish.
As we expected, Pomp's enthusiasm for the power of the individual, the power of the idea, the effect of technological advancement, which results in increasing amounts of decentralization and self-reliance over time, gives him the confidence and optimism that progress and economic growth and general prosperity is not only set to hold, but it's set to accelerate from here. We hope you enjoy this segment as much as we did. You can find Pomp on his podcasts and YouTube channel and Twitter by just typing in POMP. Anyway, on to the interview. Pomp, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. Anthony Pompliano brings a unique and optimistic perspective on many of the challenges that we face as a society that we read about in the headlines every day. It's Pomp's enthusiasm for ideas and how those ideas get transformed into action and how those actions impact society at large and the economy that distinguish his podcast from others and gives him a valuable perspective on prosperity, both individual and society. Pomp, can the prosperity that we've enjoyed over the last many decades continue at its current pace when we look at all these challenges ahead of us, particularly global debt? In particular, in 1960, the GDP per capita globally was $459, and in 2021, that number was $12,236. That's a 27-fold increase. It's about 5.7% per year. Can we keep that going? And why don't we talk a little bit about prosperity, if you don't mind defining that?
I think in the first part of like what exactly is prosperity, I actually think prosperity is defined differently by different people, which is a little bit of a unique way to look at it probably. But if I am somebody who is optimizing my life to simply have freedom, maybe actually I want to live out in a rural part of the country. I want to farm my own food, and I kind of just want to be left alone. And I find that to be the ultimate prosperity. But maybe I am a hard charger who wants to live in the heart of Manhattan and kind of have the quote unquote hard life. But it's all about how many dollars are in my bank account. And to me, that is prosperity. And so those may be even seen by outsiders as like two different ends of the spectrum. But both of those people, if they achieve kind of their goal, they think that they have reached prosperity. So I think that we can't just put one single definition on it. It is very much kind of like saying, what are you optimizing for? And if you achieve it, then you've thought of achieving prosperity. Now, in terms of will growth continue, I actually think not only will growth continue, I think it'll continue to accelerate, which is an important part. GDP of a society used to be nearly flat, and there was almost no growth. And then we started to tick up, and we had 0.5%, and then 1%, and then 1.5%, 2%, 3%, et cetera. But part of the like doomsdayer perspective is that we always focus on the US GDP growth. We always think about, is the United States going to grow, or is it going to decelerate? And so, yes, that is a perspective that is important for Americans, but there's only 330 million Americans compared to the almost 8 billion people globally. And so the global GDP is going to continue to accelerate. the micro kind of GDP growth rates of these various countries is going to be dependent on the decisions that those countries make. And really, one of the big tailwinds to GDP growth is the continued kind of creation and adoption of various technologies. And so when I look at kind of an individual person, there's this great book called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And it basically covers, about 1870 to 1940 or so. And one of the things that it talks about is during this period of drastic innovation, there was a boom in economic development and economic growth. And so a great way to think about this is in 1870 or so, every single home was completely disconnected from every other home. There were not, kind of paved roads that connected it. There was not telephones. There was not electricity. There was not running water and various other things. But by 1940, every single home in America pretty much was connected. Now, all of a sudden, we had those paved roads, electricity, we had telephones, we had running water, et cetera. But it wasn't just about can we connect all of these kind of nodes, if you will. It was also about can we build density. And so the invention of the elevator allowed for us not only to go horizontal, but now we could actually build vertical. And we could allow for not a building that was 4, 5, 6 stories tall. We could actually go up 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 stories. And so that created this like urban density that we now know to be a huge part of the prosperity of America. And so when you see kind of these various technologies that get created, I think we always want to jump to the tip of the spear. We want to jump to, artificial intelligence. We want to jump to Bitcoin or various other types of technologies. And for people who know me and my view of the world, like I think those are incredibly important technologies, and I think that they will continue to help us accelerate innovation. But I also think that there's a lot of innovation that occurs in, the industrial space or in various other industries that we may not actually think of as quote unquote technology innovation. But what it does is it continues to push forward kind of our day-to-day experience. And so thinking about the invention of an elevator and its connection to economic prosperity in America is not something that people spend a lot of time on. But I would argue that maybe it's actually one of the single most important inventions that we've actually had in America in the last 150 years. And so when you think of it from that perspective, you then start to ask yourself, what are the other technology innovations that we have had that may have outsized impact on, GDP growth or kind of economic prosperity, but don't necessarily get included in kind of the average conversation. And so I think that's really a place that people can go and do some study and exploration, and they'll come away with some new ideas.
Yeah, the technologies that don't hit the headlines, that aren't what everybody's talking about. And so what are some of the ideas at that level that you have uncovered in your discussions with people that you think hold the most promise?
Yeah, so one of the main themes throughout history has been the idea of decentralization, and decentralization is obviously foremost now talked about when it comes to Bitcoin and this idea of a decentralized network and all these nodes, et cetera. But as I just described, pretty much the history of America was decentralization. When we look at states versus the federal government, when we look at individual homes in terms of their disconnectedness with other homes, it was all about decentralization in terms of various cities, right? And kind of these nodes that all got linked together with highways or various other types of transportation modes. But also, if you think about different types of industries that have grown to be incredibly large, if you go all the way back to, again, kind of early 1800s, and you look at something like the Cargill company, Cargill Inc., this literally was various nodes of grain. And so they had these like grain storage facilities, and basically you would bring all the grain into this one location. And then that one location was one of many nodes that were all decentralized from each other. And so some of that was limited based on geography. But if you think about it from a resilience standpoint, well, if there's a forest fire somewhere, or maybe there's a heat kind of wave, or maybe there's a really bad winter somewhere, right? That decentralization created great resilience for the food supply in the United States. And so as you kind of pull that forward into this new world, I think that decentralization will continue to be a big theme. And so Bitcoin obviously gets security from decentralization. But also, I think that you're going to start to see decentralization when it comes to a lot of the computing innovations that we're watching, right? One of the big innovations over the last 15 years or so is this idea of POPs in these computing networks. And so if you look at, Amazon or a Facebook, they have very large data centers. But what they have figured out, along with the data center industry, along with telecommunications, et cetera, is how do we get these kind of edge computing sites as far out into the world as we possibly can? And although the digital native kind of population grows up and they're just like, I don't know how all this works. I just know I pull out my phone, hit some buttons, and magic happens. The computing infrastructure that is behind this is all about decentralization, right? It's actually about how do you get connectivity and infrastructure out as close to people as you possibly can. And then when you go ahead and you take a look at something like, Starlink and being able to now do this from space as well, is there may be one company that actually is, owning that satellite network, but the network itself has decentralization to it. It's not one single satellite that's trying to, run around the globe and beam the internet down. It is a decentralized network of satellites that's doing it. So I think that's like one major theme that we will continue to see play out. The second thing when it comes to technology and innovation that I think is kind of a macro theme is self-reliance. And so if you look at many of the technologies that have become quite popular over the last, 20 to 30 years, it's all about self-reliance. So you can look at the rise of the internet, the mobile phone, various apps within the mobile phone. You can look at various internet services, et cetera. It really empowered the individual to now have self-reliance. No longer did you have to go and simply get one single source of truth from a news organization or go read, the Britannica encyclopedia, right? You now could literally go to the internet and you can get a ton of different resources and it put you in the driver's seat of being able to research and gather information. It also allows you to be able to use various technologies or services to navigate different places, right? When you use things like Google Maps, et cetera. But I think that even on top of that is there's information, there's communication, there's transportation. But now what I think we're starting to see is this rise of open source software and the idea that we can put the individual in control of their finances, or maybe even in control of these automated services via artificial intelligence that will allow individuals to actually be able to be more productive, but have less people that they rely on, right? If you think of a business is actually very reliant on the employee base, right? Whoever works at that business is going to determine whether that company is successful or not. Well, when you automate some of those tasks or some of those roles, now the owners of the business become more self-reliant. It is all about, can I get the technology to do X rather than do I have to rely on these other people? And so I think that while we're talking about decentralization as one major theme, I think self-reliance is a second major theme that we'll see kind of continue to play out. But the nice thing is that even though these overarching themes may appear to be new, the technologies that are really kind of benefiting from this, again, artificial intelligence, Bitcoin, there's a bunch of stuff in biotech. I think there's a lot of stuff in space, et cetera. They're pretty well known, right? We know where the big areas of innovation are going to come from. The debate is not, is space exploration or space technologies going to be more important in the future or less? It's more about which individual companies. And so it's not market selection, it's security selection to a degree. And I think that's really kind of where people are spending a lot of time trying to figure it out.
And that's a bigger trend now than it was before, finding the right company. Before, the right company with the right technology could succeed despite itself more easily than in today's world.
I think competition is, again, the DNA of every great civilization. And so if you go even all the way back to ancient Rome, right, there was competition throughout society. There was competition on a local basis in terms of various merchants. There was competition among the farmers. There was competition even at the highest levels in terms of who was going to be emperor. And sometimes that competition played out in a very democratic type process. And sometimes that competition literally was decided by the sword. And so when you look at that, literally civilization has been shaped by competition for thousands and thousands of years. For the entire existence of human history, competition has been at the heart of what we do. And so I think that we've also seen now experiment after experiment with various types of governance models, with various types of market models. And again, the ones that have competition at the heart of them appear to be much better and get better outcomes than ones that don't. And so when you start to look at kind of this idea of security selection, ultimately what people are trying to do is they're trying to determine who is going to win the competition. And what I find fascinating is that just as maybe somebody was sitting in the Colosseum thousands of years ago trying to determine which warrior was going to walk in there and win the competition, what essentially investors are doing today is they are wagering capital on which one of these companies are going to win the competition. And so when you understand that competition is at the, kind of essence of every single thing that we see happen in markets, you then start to think much more probabilistically than you do binary. And that probabilistic thinking, I think, is the hallmark of every great investor. And so as you look inside of these industries and you start looking at the kind of individual security selection, now with probabilistic thinking, you don't simply sit there and say, well, is this a good idea or is it not? Because the idea actually is not that important, right? There's a lot of people with the ideas, but you start to focus on things that actually may have a bigger impact on the outcome. Who is the person who's actually leading this business? What is the capital requirement? How much execution risk is there going to be? What is the regulatory or market risk that there's going to be? How can I actually underwrite this in terms of the ability for them to take this technology and commercialize it and drive revenue, et cetera? And so when you look at that type of risk and in this competition focused model, all of a sudden, something like venture capital makes a ton of sense because it is milestone based funding. So somebody says, hey, I have this idea and I'm going to go accomplish A, B, and C. I need $1 million. Okay, here's $1 million. Go accomplish A, B, and C. And if you do that, if you do what you say you're going to do in this competition, then you unlock the next tranche of funding. It's very different than, let's say, in the corporate world where somebody just says, okay, we're going to go into this new market. I need $500 million. And it's like, yes, no kind of binary type outcome. And so I think that what we are starting to see is this convergence of new technologies that are being funded in what is somewhat of a relatively new way. Yes, venture capital funding has been around, since the 1950s, 1960s, but still in the grand scheme of financial markets and the grand scheme of humanity, it's a very new thing, right? It's only 50, 60 years old. And so what we are seeing is that this milestone-based funding is actually purpose-built for innovation-type technologies. And so as we watch these innovation technologies get built and we start to see how much value can be created and captured by the people who build these businesses and who fund them, I think what you're going to start to see is more and more people realize the trend of the next 20 to 30 years is going to be about who participated in these innovative technologies and who kind of sat back and just allowed themselves to be disrupted. And again, maybe that is a story as old as time as well, but I tend to think that the innovation technologies is drastically outperforming from a financial standpoint, these other kind of businesses. And so you'll naturally just see capital flow to kind of where it can grow the fastest.
The common view is that large entities, governmental, corporate, everything are becoming monopolistic. The FANG stocks, and there's much more of a trend towards concentration of power and a suppression of individual capability. And that's actually the opposite of what is actually going on. If you go back a few decades, there was not a mountain of capital available for entrepreneurs. The venture capital industry was way too small. And so, for instance, MBAs graduating from business schools wound up flocking towards the large organizations, and there were no opportunities for them to join startup companies. And now it's one of the largest placements from business schools. And so what you're talking about is something that is very interesting because it's not very visible. People don't, it's not a big story. The big story is how evil all the large corporations are and how evil the government is.
Look, again, if you go back to that idea of competition, right? Maybe that we have monopolies because the challengers aren't good enough, or maybe they haven't built good enough products and services yet. And so, if you would have asked people maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago, is Facebook a monopoly, right? Is Instagram a monopoly? They have WhatsApp, they have all these different products. People would have said, yes, of course, we have to break up big tech. And then TikTok came out of almost nowhere. Well, it was a good enough product. People flocked to it. And so I think we like to kind of fall back on becoming a nation of complainers. And one of the things I continue to respond to people and kind of remind them of, we don't need to be a nation of complainers. We need to be a nation of competitors. And in order to take down monopolistic powers, you have to compete in the market. And if you build a good enough product, you can still win. It's just that the previous attempts that people have had, they haven't been good enough. And yes, I understand network effects are incredibly powerful. I understand that there's all sorts of pricing power that you can get by having size. But at the same exact time, we have Amazon and we have Shopify. And so, yes, maybe Amazon does have more than 50% of e-commerce, but Shopify seems to be doing pretty well. Their mantra of arming the rebels appears to have resonated with millions of users. And so they built a great product that ended up being able to service a customer in a way that Amazon couldn't, and Shopify built this great business. And so if you go through each individual sector and you look at the incumbent type technologies or products, and you ask yourself, why have they not been disrupted? Usually, although it's unpopular, the answer is because no one has figured out a good enough product that is 10x better. But if they did, all of a sudden, you would see the exact opposite happen. It's almost a judo move where you use the weight of the actual incumbent against themselves, because many of them can't respond quickly. They can't actually go ahead and get up to speed on certain things. And I think what you're seeing with artificial intelligence is a great example. You know, ChatGPT, it was long thought that Google had some sort of monopoly on search. And literally overnight, you have people who are writing all their opinion pieces saying that Google's reign on search is over. And it took a company, which now they worked on it for a few years, but it took one company to change the narrative. And so ultimately, I think that we have to get away from that state of complaining and constantly going back to saying, oh, this bad, evil, centralized, monopolistic technology company. And instead say, how, as the challenger with less resources, but the benefit of time and speed, how do we compete? How do we build something that's better, that can go after their customers and say, we have something that can actually service your needs in a way that they can't? If you do that, all of a sudden, it changes the game.
Well, I guess there's a logical extension of this as well, that the large concentrated entities that stand to lose are actually less capable of defending themselves going forward than they have been in the past. That the power of technology in the hands of entrepreneurs really enables them to have a larger ability to win than in the past. Is that how you look at it too? Because the government seems to be doing a lot, particularly in the crypto world in the last 3 months, to do what they can to thwart its development in the United States, at least. And this would argue that they can try all they want, but it's going to be increasingly difficult for a centralized entity to slow down progress.
Let's use two examples. Let's use media competing with artificial intelligence, and let's use Bitcoin competing with fiat currencies, right? So on the artificial intelligence media side, Barry Diller, IAC, came out recently, and he's thought that we should try to somehow regulate or ban the use of these technologies. He admitted that he didn't think that it'd be possible to slow them down, but he was very worried. Obviously, there's a lot of media properties, and his worry was that we were going to displace a lot of workers. And so my response to that is compete or die. If your writers can't write better than the machine, then they will lose their jobs. Because ultimately, if your job can be automated away by a computer, then it probably will be, right? And so while that may not be popular, that may not get people excited, that may actually scare the hell out of some people. Well, guess what? That is what's going to happen. And so you can try to fight the trend. You can try to fight, what is coming from an innovation standpoint, or you can embrace it. And so how much better off would those writers be if they immediately said, you know what? I used to be able to write 2 articles a day. Now I can write 20 because I have a brand new piece of technology that previously wasn't available to me. And now I have actually become much more productive. Again, the nation of complainers or the nation of competitors. And so I think that's a perfect example where the incumbents are scared, but rather than try to embrace the technology, they instead complain, and they want to see some way to regulate it or use litigation in order to slow down the progress and try to protect the castle that they've built. But if the castle's made of sand, Doesn't take a lot of water to simply change what you own. In terms of Bitcoin and fiat currencies, I think you find something very similar. You see that Bitcoin has been a much better store of value than a fiat currency. And so although the promise of Bitcoin is that it will become a peer-to-peer decentralized electronic cash system, people will buy products and services using this new system. Right now, today, I think majority of people, and we see it in the data, over 60% of all Bitcoin that's been in circulation has not moved in over a year. People are using it as a store of value. And why are they doing that? It's because it's superior to any other fiat currency in the world in terms of a store of value. It's superior to gold or any other asset. If you bought Bitcoin and you held it for years, you've done pretty well from a financial return standpoint. Your purchasing power has increased, not decreased, which is very rare in the financial world. And so when you look at that, Bitcoin, although we don't know who the creator is, although there is no marketing team, no board of directors, no executive team, et cetera, it's a better solution. It competed in the free market, and it's convinced hundreds of millions of people to allocate their capital as a store of value to it versus something else. So again, it's a perfect example. You can go and you can try to regulate it. You can try to litigate it. You can try to do all these different things, but you can't stop it. It's decentralized and the cat's out of the bag. An idea's time has come. And so what you're seeing is that the competition is driving the outcome. And so I think you can go and apply this same kind of mechanism across all these different markets. And what you begin to understand is that actually one of the great red flags, one of the great alarm systems, if you will, is when you see somebody who is an incumbent who is complaining, they are likely to be the next up to be disrupted because they already have the loser mentality.
Embracing victimhood.
Yes, they already have psychologically given up on the competition. They are the equivalent of that gladiator sitting inside of the Colosseum saying, his sword is too sharp. I should instead not have to fight him. You're probably not going to do so hot when you meet the guy with the sword that you believe is too sharp.
That's a good example.
So eventually, if you understand and believe that markets are built on competition, when you see someone complaining, they likely are to be the next disrupted.
Related to all this is the idea of business models as well, because they've been evolving as too, and you spend a lot of time with entrepreneurs talking about new business models. One great example is Kodak. When they learned about digital photography, they wound up building a huge R&D department. They filed thousands of patents, and then they went out and bought tons of patents, and they thought that they would defend themselves by owning all the patents. And as they said, well, we'll just cut the price down to a penny per picture instead of 30 cents a picture. And Facebook came along and became the biggest photography company in the world for free. Totally missed the whole idea of a business model. Are there business models out there that you're seeing that are that represent a kind of a breakthrough, or is it still just an evolution?
I think that there's a lot of evolutions. The thing about business models is there's a lot of recycling that happens, right? If you actually think about, Facebook basically had free content and then they sold ads against it. That sounds a lot like, free newspapers. It just happened to be in a digital format, right? If you go kind of throughout history, you can see that people have constantly tried to innovate on business models. And usually the innovation is simply the addition of a couple of different parts from other industries or other times in history. And it may look new, it may look shiny, but really there's only about 3 different ways you get paid, right? Somebody pays you for your product or your service. Somebody is using your product and service, and you essentially put a tax on their usage by taking a piece of whatever is going through, or you give away your product or service, and then you allow someone to monetize the eyeballs that you've captured. But if you go across all of these different business models, that's pretty much it, right? And so people are like, well, what about real estate? Somebody's paying you for your product or service, right? And so you kind of go through each one of these things, even if it's not a technology company, and you realize like that's essentially what it boils down to. Now, there's all kinds of really cool, kind of intricacies or ways that you can go ahead and you can say, you know what, I'm going to put this element on it that is essentially a marketing message. I'm an investor in a company that is trying to compete with Zoom as an example. And rather than say to all of their corporate customers, you have to pay us based on the number of employees you have, They simply say, you pay us based on the employees you have that use our product in any one given month. So you don't pay on total users, you pay on active users. Now, again, that simply boils down to the company is paying for the product or service, right? It's a very well-known business model, but there's this nuance or this change that they've made where it actually ends up being a better win-win, where now all of a sudden the company that's created the software, they simply are optimized to get people using the product. The incentive system is there. And then the company that is consuming the software understands that they are not going to be paying for employees that are not using it or not getting value out of it. And so I think that you continue to see on the edges these, slight innovations or these slight kind of changes, but ultimately it falls back on those three business models. And I think that that's not going to change.
And one of the trends, of course, has been profit per employee, where there are increasing numbers of businesses that can operate with very few people. I think you sent the tweet out recently. Who's created $1 billion company using one person, right, or the fewest number of employees? And I think that's also enormously liberating for consumers, is that the amount that you're paying is going to be set at more of the marginal cost, which is much lower over time, which has been a consumer trend for a very long time. Are there what areas outside of the world of finance are ideas that you've run across that entrepreneurs in the social world or the political world or whatever else may help calm down the headlines about societal disruption?
Yeah, I don't think society is going to be disrupted. I think that the people on the internet have too much free time on their hands, which is a signal that actually we're pretty prosperous, right? If you've got enough time to be arguing with people on Twitter, then you probably got a pretty good life, right? I one time saw a viral clip from the rapper 50 Cent. He was given an interview, and basically somebody asked him about depression. And he gave this very somber answer, which I think was somewhat controversial, but I think highlighted an important point. He said, where I come from, depression is a luxury. He said, the people that I grew up with, they were working 2 and 3 jobs. They didn't have time to sit and think about stuff. All they were worried about, all they were focused on was, how can I go get the next paycheck so I can pay rent, so I can put food on the table for my family? And again, now he is talking about a degree of poverty that thankfully most people in the United States don't live in. He's talking about something, though, that is actually much more the norm on a global basis. There's a much larger portion of the population that live in conditions like that. But his point essentially was there's a bunch of things in society that kind of the elites or the people on the internet are contemplating, discussing, who are constantly arguing over, that is actually a luxury for a blue collar worker or for somebody who has 2 jobs or who feels like they're falling behind. And so unfortunately, in the United States, what we see is when we look at the economic data, I think it's something like 50% of people who make $100,000 feel like they're living paycheck to paycheck. Somewhere close to 70% of all American citizens feel like they're living paycheck to paycheck, regardless of their income. It's not a good economic situation. And so when you then go and you look and say, okay, we know that finance needs innovation. We know that technology hopefully can solve some of these problems, can put these people in a better situation. The question goes to, where else is that innovation happening? And so artificial intelligence, I think, is something that has become its own industry, but it will be applied across other industries. So you'll see it literally show up in every single area. If you think inside of a business, you can imagine something like somebody saying to a large language model, hey, I want you to go ahead and I want you to go find every prospective customer that we could have. I want you to take their contact information. I want you to put it into a CRM. I want you to draft up an email. I want you to personalize that email to each individual contact. I want you to email it out to them. I want you to include a link to some sort of scheduling mechanism. And I want you to get calls scheduled for our sales team. Well, if you're able to do that in an automated fashion, you just eliminated a lot of SDRs. And so now you're changing the dynamics of that business. You're shrinking the number of employees. You're increasing the productivity, and you're doing so with much more control. And so that's a great example where that doesn't matter if you're selling software or you're selling plastic cups. If you've got a sales team, you're going to start using these technologies. If you then jump to somewhere, let's say like the biotech industry, there's going to be all sorts of innovations that we're already seeing, right? There's a lot of speculation about various psychedelic drugs that are going to be approved for different therapeutic uses. We see all sorts of different kind of embeddable technologies. Obviously, things like brain-computer interfaces are getting all the headlines, but you can go through and literally the invention of a pacemaker and think about how much of a great invention that was and how it's extended people's lives and been able to have this great impact. There's going to be other technologies like that that will be embedded into the human body using various technologies that will improve the life, will extend kind of lifespan, and also extend how healthy you are and how long you can stay healthy. Then if you jump to areas like space and kind of technologies there, I invested in a business that is doing space manufacturing. Quite literally, they are sending, kind of hardware up into space, and it's a space factory. And so they will be able to manufacture various goods. They then will bring it back through reentry down back to Earth. And so you can look at, again, the biopharmaceutical space. They're going to actually be able to do certain things in a zero gravity environment that may be difficult on Earth. If you then jump to things like kind of this American dynamism type trend, this idea of maybe actually we need to shore up various industries that are important and vital to American success in the future. And so this can be things in manufacturing, this can be things in national defense, et cetera. But I think that there's an entire body there of just like, what is it going to take for America to continue to succeed? And how do we invest in those technologies? And then the last one is an area that I've been spending a lot of time on, which I'll call the industrial space. If you really think about that industrial space, there are very few innovations that have happened there in terms of what we consider on the technology side. There's a number of large companies that have continued to build a dominant position in the market. And most of the people who own these businesses are quite old, right? They're at 40, 50-year points in their career. And so I think that there's going to be a renaissance of young people who show up and they say, you know what, it's cool to build apps, it's cool to build technology, but we still need things done in the real world. And so what does that look like? How do you do that in kind of a better economic model? How do you do that using various technologies? How do you maybe continue to produce as much revenue or profit as some of the competitors, but do it with less employees or more efficiency and lower costs? And so I think that there's kind of an explosion of innovation that's happening. The problem is that actually the things that are talked about in the headlines tend to be only the most controversial ones. Is AI safe or not? Is Bitcoin safe or not? But what you find is as you dig into this stuff, the people in the industry, they spend almost no time thinking about that. They're too focused. Their heads are down, they're building, and what they're trying to do is solve problems for their customers. And I tend to think that that is the difference between the talking head class and the actual builders. And so I like to spend as much time as I can with the builders because they tend to have a better view of the future than the people who are just the talking heads.
Keep thinking about the power of the individual and ingenuity over what everybody is focused on. And a lot of our speakers have been talking about how much global credit has expanded and the potential problems that that poses for policy over the next decade or so. And our newsletter focuses on financial markets and government policy. And so we're really focused on what's happening around the corner. If you look at global debt to GDP today, it's gotten to 355%, according to the IMF, up from 269 just since 2007. And without the bank debt, it's 96% versus 62. And what's really happened since 1985 is this explosion of debt. In the past, when these problems have surfaced, governments have imposed more control and exercised more power over their citizens to correct that problem. And it seems like today we have a plethora of technologies that will make that much more difficult for governments. What do you think about this problem and how it resolves itself?
So debt to GDP is an interesting one because basically you have two competing forces with each other. The first is when the money's not real, people create it out of thin air. And that's where you get the debt, ballooning at an incredible rate. But debt is only one part of that equation. The GDP growth also is not growing nearly fast enough. And so I always joke that when people talk about debt to GDP as a problem, all they want to talk about is how do we reduce the debt? And I say, well, what if we could grow our way out of the problem? Right. And now, of course, I think that the latest estimate I saw, I forget who did it. It's like we'd have to grow GDP in the United States at like 12% in order to even have a chance. I don't see that happening anytime soon. But again, if we could go from a nation of complainers to competitors, maybe we could. And so I think that when you look at that number specifically, yes, obviously we should slow down the growth of debt, but also maybe we should increase GDP growth. And if we were focused on doing it, it's what you measure is what you move. Maybe if we actually were focused there, we could actually move that number. And so I think that's kind of one huge component of it. At the same time, when you look at people who are saying to themselves, okay, like what is going to happen on the policy front? I tend to think that there are folks who are incredibly worried about this debt to GDP. But one of the beauties is if you can print money, why can't it be 1,000% or 2,000%? Right. And so to your point, well, because all of a sudden the money would be worthless. And if the money becomes worthless, then all of a sudden the people realize that the money is worthless and they begin to do things that maybe the government doesn't like. And that's where you get that clamping down, right? Again, story as old as time. As the devaluation of a currency happens, the government realizes it's losing control. Rather than ceding that control, they simply try to tighten the control, which accelerates kind of the feedback from their population. But again, I don't think that necessarily politicians or other leaders around the world are students of history. I think instead it's human nature takes over. One of the things that I really respect about Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger is they constantly talk about, hey, we don't think that human nature changes. And so we simply want to be students of human nature. It's been happening for thousands of years. It's probably going to continue to happen. I tend to agree with that viewpoint. And so naturally, I do think that the only way that there is some sort of division or a break from the past is there has to be technology. Now, historically, a lot of that technology has been offensive technology. It has been tools of war. It has literally been, if my government has a bow and arrow and I have a gun, I may have an advantage. But I don't think that that is necessarily what happens in the cyber world. So I have this thesis that I've talked about quite a bit, which is historically, the global reserve currency was put into place by the country with the strongest military. It's the strongest offense. They had the fastest ships, they had the greatest bombs, and they simply were able to put military dominance in place anywhere in the world. They, through that military force, were able to establish their currency as the global reserve currency. And so for literally centuries, it was all about who has military dominance. They get the global reserve currency. They are able to impose their will in commerce around the globe. In a cyber world, though, it's not about offense. It's all about defense. Whoever has the greatest defense has the most power because they simply cannot let anyone in. And so naturally, that is why I'm so bullish on Bitcoin. It's the strongest computer network in the world. It's fully decentralized. And I tend to think that Bitcoin will be the first global reserve currency that is ushered in over decades, but it'll do it without dropping a single bomb, shooting a single bullet, or harming a single individual. Now, if that thesis is true, which I believe it is, then naturally you can go and you can look at all the other technologies, cryptography being a great example. How do you prevent against surveillance? We use cryptography. It's the same reason why the government uses it, because the government is protecting their information from other governments. It's protecting their information from their own citizens. So cryptography has become a great tool to ensure privacy. And as you go down the line of all these technologies, you realize technology is the great equalizer. No matter how many resources you have, no matter how big your team is, no matter how many groups of humans are actually following you or listening to you, technology allows for anyone in the world to be put on an even playing field now with nation states. And so when you think about it from that perspective, historically, these technologies were adopted in a very kind of top-down manner. You had militaries that went ahead and funded and created or invented these technologies. Those militaries used it to their advantage. They then passed those technologies to the nation state. The nation state then passed them down to corporations and then eventually to individuals. And so individuals were the last people to adopt these technologies. Look at the internet, look at computers, various other types of technologies. But now with the rise of artificial intelligence or with the rise of Bitcoin, we're seeing actually a bottoms up adoption of these technologies. Today, there's literally a 14-year-old kid sitting in the United States with an internet connection who's talking to a 16-year-old kid with an internet connection in India. And those two kids have more at their fingertips than some nation states do. The capabilities of artificial intelligence is empowering them in ways that the government is trying to catch up to. And so then if you look at something like Bitcoin, it's the exact same thing. You literally not only have a protection of your purchasing power, but you also have a decentralized network that has taken billions of dollars to create, where all of these miners, these node operators, and these developers are working in concert with each other to protect your economic value. That literally was reserved historically only for kings or nation states. And now it's in the hands of every individual. And so it's this time of rapid change, but at the same time, I think that the writing's been on the wall for a while. It's simply now we are getting these technologies built into a way that consumers can adopt it. The communication speed on the internet allows for people to find out about them quickly and to go ahead and, as they're adopting it, ask questions, learn, and get more confidence. And so I think that rather than believing we're going to have kind of a regression back to the historical norm, I actually think we're going to have an acceleration from here. We'll get more technologies. We'll get people adopting them faster. Those people will then tell other people because of the speed of communication on the internet. And what you're going to find is that innovation is going to accelerate, not decelerate. And so naturally, as you, again, to borrow Shopify's mantra, if you arm the rebels, now you have this balancing of power. And I tend to think that a balance of power is actually better on a net basis for humans around the world, rather than having any one group, any one nation state, or any one organization have that concentration of power.
Well, this also leads to the natural theoretical erosion of the purpose for nation states, as a means of tribal organization. The tribes can be formed in different ways that wind up making much more sense on any number of levels.
So on that, like, that's an interesting question, right? Is like, do we need nation states? And I always remind folks, like, what we are talking about here is the nation state serves many different purposes. Some of them are cohesion of social fabric, right? Some of them are national defense and everything in between. And so I always kind of laugh, like some of them are literally like bare metal, right? On the military side, and some of it's like the feel good stuff, or maybe the social safety nets or whatever. And so on a net basis, I still believe that nation states not only are essential in terms of providing for individuals, but I think that nation states actually are going to continue to be an integral part of societies moving forward. Maybe we don't call them countries, maybe we call them, governance systems or whatever. But ultimately, again, since the start of human history, we have taken humans, we have put them into geographic locations, we have surrounded them with some sort of governance system. Those people have been in charge of providing for their people and providing defense, food, etc. And so I don't think that's going away anytime soon. But what I do think is going to happen is that there's going to be an increase in competition among these countries. We talk very fondly of many of our ancestors who came to the United States. If you go ahead and you look at some of the individuals who came from various places in Europe to the US, there are these stories of like maiden voyages, or when they got here and they were given as a family a certain number of acres and they had to go out and build their home from scratch. They had to defend for themselves. They had to go find their own food, etc. It's a hard life. And it took an enormous amount of courage or something so catastrophic in your homeland that you were running from it. And so when we look at those things, we talk about them fondly because we can't fathom having to do that today. Right. But then if we even accelerate and we look at something like, if you talk to, or you ever hear Sam Zell talk about how his family literally caught the last train out and how he feels so fortunate to be able to grow up in the United States. Again, he talks fondly about it because they were running so aggressively from something so horrific. And so naturally, if we think about that, the United States was the beneficiary of basically a bunch of other people screwing up and the promise of something new. And so what I think we're going to start to see is maybe actually as competition increases between these countries, citizens will be able to move more freely between them. And so it actually means that you have to be more competitive, not less. It's easy to be kind of lethargic when your customers can't leave, when it takes such immense effort to get on a ship and be on there for months, right, to get somewhere else. Now you can simply hop on an airplane and you can literally be somewhere else in hours. And so I think that the mobility that the citizens around the world now have has actually increased the competition. And then if you look at the US level, states alone, right? There's been a huge loss of population in California and New York, and they moved to Texas and Florida. Why did they do that? Well, because there was a state competition and California and New York screwed it up and Texas and Florida seem to have won that one. Okay. Now the competition continues and there will be more events in the future and we'll see if that holds or not. But I tend to think of not only do you have this nation state competition, but now you have a state by state competition. And what I think you're going to continue to see is you're going to continue to see, although we have all these great technologies and all these great communications with people around the world, your local community ends up being really important as well. And so it seems like we are starting to see this renewed interest over the last 3 years in what's going on in local politics. Who's on my school board? Who's in part of my, county commission? What are these rules? Why do we have to follow certain things? Is this person a good decision maker or are they not? Who's in charge of what my kid's learning at school? right? All these things that are going on, I tend to think is quite interesting because now we're more connected than ever. Yet it feels like we're starting to realize the single most important thing is still, where do you live? And who's in charge and who's helping to make some of those decisions? So I think that it's a great time to have all these technologies. But again, going back to the Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, human nature doesn't change. And I don't think that nation states are going anywhere.
Yeah. Well, you have, I think over 1,000, 1,100, nearly 1,200 interviews. I suspect that at some level you think of them as your babies. Are there any babies that are particularly more attractive than other babies? Are there any podcasts that you remember and as just mind blowing and changing your perspective on something?
There's so many of them. I would never be able to name them all. Look, the podcast, frankly, is the most selfish thing that I do. I learn an incredible amount from these individuals. I'm very fortunate that they're willing to spend time to share all the insights and knowledge and experience that they have. It's kind of a cheat code, if you will, from a learning perspective. Some of the conversations that I found really interesting and valuable on Bitcoin specifically, probably the two conversations that stick out most to me is back in 2018, I had a conversation with a guy named Murad Mahabdev. And Murad basically was the first person who said, listen, not only is Bitcoin going to be successful and it's going to expand its market cap, but it's also going to eat into the store of value assets. It's going to help to demonetize gold, art, and other various asset classes. And so therefore, Bitcoin isn't a thing of how does it go from 3,000 to 10,000. It's how does Bitcoin go from 3,000 to millions of dollars. And I think it was just eye-opening to think about over a long period of time, given the properties of Bitcoin and these other assets, what is potentially going to happen. The second one is Jason Lowry. Jason Lowry is, I believe, a captain in Space Force. He was the first person who explained how Bitcoin is actually a defense mechanism, how it's a national security issue, and the United States needs to immediately adopt Bitcoin, use the projectile power of Bitcoin to help protect economic value of American citizens. And so I think that's another conversation. Both of those conversations, their efficacy was measured by the fact that as soon as I got done talking to them, literally while they still were in the room, I said, hold on a second. And I went and I bought more Bitcoin. So that tends to be a quality conversation. In terms of, maybe a conversation has nothing to do with technology. There's a gentleman named Mackenzie Collins who came on the podcast. He had DM'd me and he just simply said, hey, listen, I have no reason to come on your podcast. You don't know me. I got nothing that I've done in my life that would suggest that you would want me on your podcast, but I'm just a regular guy. I listen to your podcast every day, and maybe people want to listen to your regular conversation. And I don't know why. I probably had been asked that, 500 times before. People had reached out and said, hey, can I come on the podcast? I got nothing, no reason. But for some reason, I said, look, this is the guy. And so I brought him on and he said to me one sentence. And he said, I'm not trying to take over the world. I'm just trying to provide a better life for my family. I'm not trying to take over the world. I'm just trying to provide a better life for my family. And I remember thinking to myself, that is the essence of so many different people. Although you're in this kind of high degree of success, hard charging world of business and finance and investing, and we see all these people who want global domination or billions of dollars in their bank account, the average citizen simply just wants a better life. They want more security. They want to be able to go do the things that they want to do. And really what they're chasing is freedom. And so that was a really powerful conversation in terms of just, a reminder of how the world works and what humans are really trying to accomplish. And then
yeah. Go ahead.
I was going to say one other conversation that, still to this day, I find quite interesting is when I was 20 years old, I read 3 books. One was Rich Dad, Poor Dad. One was Think and Grow Rich. And the other was The Richest Man in Babylon. I read them in succession. And they were really the first books that I read out of personal enjoyment. And hey, I want to learn this stuff, right? It's not something that's being assigned by school. I'm actually going to go and learn for myself. And so at one point I interviewed Robert Kiyosaki, the author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. I remember when I was sitting there talking to him, I thought back about a decade prior, and I said to myself, man, if I could have told 20-year-old me that this guy would be asking me to come talk to me, you couldn't have paid me money to believe that. And so it was another just great data point in terms of, if you do the things that you really enjoy doing, you'll surprise yourself in terms of what you can accomplish and kind of how far from a progress standpoint you can go. And so the podcast has been amazing. I've learned a ton, and it's fortunate that I can share those conversations with other people, and hopefully they're learning just as much as me.
I was going to say the last the last one of the podcasts that you referred to about the gentleman who just wanted to do better for his family. takes us right back to the start, which is prosperity is relative to what you want to accomplish and what you need, and according to what drives you. This has been an incredibly optimistic and reinforcing conversation. It really is true that so much of what has propelled our society operates in the world that's hard to see. It's the day-to-day, and the increased freedoms and opportunities that each person has with each technological development. And thank you very much for putting it into a fascinating perspective. Pomp, it's great having you on. Thanks so much.
I'll leave you with one thought, which is if you could pick any time in human history to live, it would be tomorrow. The second greatest time to live would be today. And so although there's a lot of problems and we all want to improve them, we happen to live in the safest, most economically prosperous time in human history. We're very fortunate to be in that situation. And so maybe we should try to extend it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Pomp.
Thanks for having
Take
me.
care.